What's good, you guys? C.A.S.T back with another video, and today we're going over part 2 of the Gamer's Survivor's Guide to the GP RAM Apocalypse. Now, in part 1, we were talking primarily about graphics cards, for one, how to pick the right graphics card for your system, and how to optimize it so that you get the most performance for your dollar and can get it to last literally forever, or at least as long as it is for prices to go back to normal. But today we're going to be talking about something a little bit more nuanced that not that many people really have a great of an understanding of, but hopefully with this video, you'll get the information you need to be able to make the right decision on what parts you should be upgrading and how long you can be using your old system. Because there could be a lot more performance left on the table that you're not tapping into. Today we're talking about PC bottlenecks and what you can do to avoid them and mitigate them to the best of your abilities. So let's get into it. Now, what is a PC bottleneck? Well, what better way to show you guys than to use an actual bottle? Um, Essentially, you have the fluid in a bottle, right? But you're limited by how much water can actually come out of it based on how big the opening is at the top of the bottle. In the same way, with a bottleneck in a gaming PC or any PC in general, you're going to be limited by your weakest link. You might have the potential in your graphics card or your other system components to be able to hit a certain FPS number, but your CPU or your SSD or whatever it might be limiting you down to a much lower performance level. Now, the common methodology that people use is to try to make sure that both the CPU and the GPU and the whole ecosystem of your gaming PC is built in a certain way that will allow both components to be maximized as far as their utilization goes whenever they are running a certain task. Now, you don't necessarily want to have your CPU hitting 100% all the time when playing a video game, but you want to be able to utilize your graphics card to its fullest potential to be able to get max boost clocks and utilization so that your FPS number that you're seeing through the screen is as high as possible. And this is done primarily as a money savings option. Whenever you're building a PC for the first time, if you are severely CPU or GPU bottlenecked, it would have made more sense to buy a lower SKU part instead of a higher SKU part because you would have saved money for the actual relative performance you get. For an extreme example, if you paired a RTX 5090 or a 9070 XT with a dual core Pentium processor from 2009, you will probably be limiting yourself around like the 60 FPS range, at which point you might as well have been better off pairing that same CPU with the likes of an RX 580. Both are going to give you pretty much the exact same gaming performance, and you're going to be severely spending way too much money going to $2,000 versus just buying an $80 graphics card in 2026. Now, while this is a very good methodology in order to save money and build a very good price performance dollar per FPS or FPS per dollar PC build, which is what most people try to focus on, it might not make that much sense outside of this specific use case. And in all honesty, there should be more nuance whenever using this methodology. Let's talk about someone that might have been building a PC back in 2020, assuming that the prices have now normalized and we're going to be going based on MSRP because back during COVID, there was a huge chip shortage and it was just a crazy time. But let's just go based on MSRP for the sake of the argument. Let's say you were debating between buying a RX 6800 XT or a GTX 3070. I think both of those graphics cards were roughly around the same price at that point, and a lot of people make the argument that the 6800 XT was the more superior graphics card. I think it had higher raster performance, more VRAM, I think double the VRAM, and this bar none was a very good graphics card for its time. And let's say that you decide to go with a 6-core like Ryzen 5 5600X to be able to save some money on the back end. You didn't decide to go with a higher end CPU. You saved some money on some memory. You saved some money on the cooler because you went with a lower SKU CPU. You bought a budget based motherboard. And since the 5600X is more power efficient, you were able to squeeze everything out through a 650 to 700 watt power supply. You could have saved maybe $300 to $400 in comparison to if you bought a bigger case with an AIO, a higher end chipset, a higher SKU CPU, and a more powerful power supply with a 3070 and gotten similar, if not better, performance in 2020. So a lot of people probably would lean more towards that specific PC build rather than the original. But if we were to fast forward to 2026, how have those PCs naturally aged? Well, the 6800 XT is still a very capable graphics card, but when it comes to feature sets and software, the RTX 3070 Ti has actually aged much, much nicer. You have access to DLSS 4.5 upscaling, which realistically is the main feature that most gamers are going to want to use. And the 6800 XT, while stronger raster performance, is based on an older upscaler technology. I think you're able to get up to FSR 3, which has a significant image quality disadvantage when compared to DLSS 4.5. And I think that there were some debates on whether or not these were going to be continuing to get driver support down the future. Just generally, I think NVIDIA has the architecture and the software suite and the team behind them to maintain driver support for the 30 series longer than AMD has for the 6000 series. So you might be getting forced into a GPU upgrade sooner than you would than if you had the NVIDIA based system. And if you're going to do an upgrade to something more modern with how power delivery and power draw is getting much higher on modern day graphics cards, you probably would be looking at getting a upgraded power supply. If you got any sort of modern graphics card with 5600X, you are going to be bottlenecks. You're going to probably want to upgrade to a 1500X 3D, which is a significantly hotter running CPU, at which point you need to get an upgraded cooler. So all those dollars that you could have saved, by doing it originally, or you originally did save back in 2020, you're now having to spend more to get something equivalent to be able to do that specific upgrade. Now, there are 5 major bottlenecks that you could experience in your PC that you need to be mindful of, and depending on what workload you have, you're probably going to want to target at least one of these to be able to maximize the performance that you have, because a bottleneck in a gaming PC and for gaming workloads is going to be different than a bottleneck for workstation, video editing, simulation type of workloads. It really just depends on what your specific task or software is going to be stressing most in your system. But the 5 things are going to be your CPU, your GPU, your storage, your memory, and the thermal capabilities of your system. Let's start with memory because that's honestly probably the worst offender of a bottleneck in a system. And this is mostly going to show itself if you don't have enough RAM capacity. Now, this really shouldn't be an issue with modern systems. I would say most pre-built laptops and kits of memory that you can buy are going to be at least 16 gigabytes. You really have to go out of your way to get anything less than that nowadays. But if you do have 8 gigabytes in your system, or God forbid, 4 gigabytes of RAM, you're going to be hitting that headroom, or hitting that wall of going over that allotted amount very, very frequently. And the way computers work is that if you run out of system memory, it's going to start offloading certain tasks to be run on your hard drive, whether this is an SSD or a spinning hard drive. And if it's the latter, which, let's be honest, if your system has 8 gigabytes of memory, it also is more likely to have a hard drive. It's been a while since we stopped using hard drives as main boot drives in systems. So again, 8 gigabytes, spinning hard drive, that's kind of a match made in heaven. And I've experienced this a lot in work where we have a lot older Dell Optiplex desktops where they come to crawling, screeching halts, run into memory corruption, file corruption, blue screens, just because we run out of memory. Those workloads are offloaded onto the hard drive, which is already, struggling to keep up with Windows itself, and just ends up in a bad time. This is going to impact pretty much every single workload, whether it's gaming or professional workloads on your system. Not having enough memory is going to result in bad times and also possibly file corruption or even system corruption on your PC. Now, the next one is probably going to be storage. This really isn't a huge issue with SSDs unless you're almost full on the SSD. I'm talking maybe like less than 5% of the total capacity of your storage is available at a given time. Now, quick side note, this is why a lot of OEMs format their hard drives to have at least 10% of them being unallocated so that you don't hit up on that threshold of like fully maxing it out. That way you can still maintain some level of performance in your SSD. But most of the cases, the more SSD is fully utilized or fully full, the slower it is actually going to be able to run tasks and run your OS. Now, if you run a spinning hard drive, it's pretty much going to be slow just in general, just because read and write speeds are slow across the board. But if you have sufficient enough memory, system memory and a spinning hard drive, you actually will have a much better experience than if you have 8 gigabytes of memory and SSD. It just kind of is how much more important memory is than the actual storage that you have in your system. Now, certain games also aren't going to necessarily function the best on slow storage either. Being able to access shaders or certain assets in the game, you could have extremely long load times, or since a lot of games now are streaming shaders like over the internet live, that can also put a lot of strain on your system as well. You might want to like store that in storage, and if it's calling up these specific shaders at a given moment and your drive isn't fast enough, then you're going to run into assets popping in and out as you play your video games, which can be very distracting, even if your FPS is somewhat solid. Now, graphics cards would be the third worst offender, And really, it's not going to be that big of an issue unless you are really trying to utilize your graphics card because other than just rendering your screen, which any basic sort of display output or display adapter should be capable of doing, you really aren't going to be stressing your GPU that much to be able to complete a certain task. But when playing video games, obviously your graphics card is going to be completely utilized. So if you don't have the graphics card horsepower, your games are not going to run very well, if at all. Now, the most important thing, again, is going to run up on VRAM. Your game is going to run at a certain base frame rate until you run out of max out your VRAM, at which point it will then throw over more of that rendering onto the system memory, which has much higher latency because it's not right there on the same PCB as the graphics card. So you're going to see even more frame dips, and if you don't have enough system memory, again, that could be a point at which you actually look at games starting to physically crash on your system because then it'll be offloaded to like your SSD, which you would never, never want to do. Now, finally, we have the CPU bottleneck, which in my opinion is probably the safest bottleneck to go with because any sort of modern multi-core, multi-threaded CPU is going to be relatively competent when playing video games because it just is like, again, the conductor. It's calling it the assets, bringing the assets and delivering it to the GPU. So just making the GPU's life as easy as possible in order for games to run the best. CPU really doesn't necessarily matter in a lot of video games. Now, there are certain situations where you can make a game run very poorly, but you are more likely going to be able to tune around this or set up settings around this to where you're still going to have a very good gaming experience. The way I see a CPU bottleneck and how that's actually going to affect a game, it really is just effectively a like frame limit cap on the potential FPS that a certain graphics card can hit. So while you aren't going to be able to be getting all of your graphics card, let's say you paired it with a modern graphics card, you're only be able to get 40% or 50% of the actual FPS that that graphics card is capable of actually getting you, which is kind of in line with what you're expecting. If that FPS number, that 40% number is 100 FPS, you're gonna have a good gaming experience. If it's 60 FPS, well, with modern technology, such as frame generation, you're gonna be able to turn that to 120 FPS, and now you have a very smooth gaming experience. And a lot of these games that you're playing, you're seeing reviews of these CPUs and GPU combos hitting like the 200 to 300 FPS mark, sometimes it's high 100s. So you're gonna be hitting maybe like the 90 to 110 FPS mark with that same graphics card. Pair such technologies as upscaling and frame generation, you're going to be able to literally transform and use a CPU that is super old. You're going to be able to take an old system and be able to make it perform as if it was a modern system playing modern video games. And again, the FX 9590 is literally probably the best and worst candidate to do something like this. Imagine if you had an even faster CPU like a Skylake CPU, a 7700K, 9700K, or a 4790K. You're gonna be able to take CPUs that were of this era from Intel or like first gen Ryzen and be able to get significantly higher frame rates than what this is able to, which really kind of shows you that you can use super old systems, like decade old systems, and still get very, very good gaming performance today. So now some tips and tricks to be able to optimize your bottlenecks, specifically CPU bottlenecks, in order to get the best performance, but also save some money and make your systems literally last forever. The first thing you're going to want to do is actually get the mindset of you have to pair an equivalent rated graphics card with the CPU because that's going to limit your options significantly. If you only were able to pair like a 10 series, like a 1080 Ti or older graphics card with an FX 9590, because realistically, anything more powerful than that is going to be bottlenecked by a FX 9590. Some people even say you have to drop down to like a 1060 to not be bottlenecked by this CPU. You're going to have a significantly different gaming experience than if you just bought something modern and new. Your actual system is not going to really be hurting itself at all. It's not going to be like you're hurting the graphics card in any way, shape, or form. If anything, the graphics card is going to thank you because it has less work to do. But it just makes more sense, especially if you're able to get a good deal on a more modern graphics card. Let's say that you were comparing the prices between a 1080 Ti and a 4070. Now, obviously, these graphics cards are in two completely different price categories. A 1080 Ti is like $180 and a 4070 right now is going for like 500 bucks. But if you were able to buy a 4070 for the same price as a 1080 Ti, regardless of what CPU you were actually pairing with it, you need to buy the 4070. It is the better graphics card with the more feature set, lower power draw, just better graphics card overall. And the bottleneck equation that a lot of people use only really makes sense whenever you're factoring in price. So price equivalence or price doesn't necessarily really matter. Always buy the stronger graphics card with the greater feature set and feature sets that are specifically going to benefit these older CPUs. The next thing you're gonna wanna do is actually set a frame rate limit. I actually have a frame rate limit to match my monitor, so I set it around 120 hertz. That's what my 4K TV is able to output. And this will actually cap the overall frame rate of your CPU and just the game in general. I find that this helps with latency and overall frame timing and stability because you can probably more likely to get fluctuations in FPS, at least I personally am, with the FX 9590 in comparison to a newer graphics card with a newer CPU in modern titles. Capping the FPS is just going to introduce a lot more stability into your system to where you really don't have to deal with the large fluctuations. Now, the last tip of advice I would give you if you're trying to maximize a CPU bottleneck to be able to limit the amount of negative performance you have on your system is make sure that the CPU bottleneck is realistically the only bottleneck that you would encounter. You could build a FX-based system back in 2013 with only 8 gigabytes of memory and be okay. Make sure that isn't necessarily an issue anymore. This system, the AM3 Plus platform, actually does have availability to NVMe drives, and while it is 2.0 speeds, that is still 2 times to 3 times faster than a SATA SSD. So making sure that we're getting as much performance out of this platform as possible to be able to let your system, mitigate those bottlenecks as much as possible. It's crazy how much performance fluctuation there can be on the AM3 Plus platform and probably translate to other platforms as well. Make sure that there is no thermal throttling, make sure that power delivery isn't an issue, make sure you have plenty of memory. I would just max out the memory available on your system, which might be a tall ask now if it's a DDR4 based platform, but with the DDR3 and an older based platform, really shouldn't be too much of an issue because those memory prices really haven't been affected in any way, shape, or form. Use a modern SSD. You compare a Gen 5, well, I wouldn't do a Gen 5, but a Gen 3 or even Gen 4 SSD onto an older platform and it will work. Again, we're not necessarily worried about price or performance because with these drives especially, you could get a Gen 3 and a Gen 4 drive for the exact same price because we're really talking about capacity here that's really affecting the price range more so than the actual data transfer rates. So yeah, that's pretty much a takeaway with the bottlenecks in a system and what you should and should not be looking out for. Again, this argument that you have to match the performance of the CPU, GPU, and the system in general really only makes sense if you're building a system for here and now. But again, you have to look at your specific workloads, look at the specific tasks you're going to be asked for, and look at how long you're realistically looking to use this system into the future and make these choices dynamically to be able to choose a bottleneck that isn't going to affect you as much, but if doing so allows you to get more longevity and performance otherwise, it might be something worth doing. Make sure to leave comments in the comment section if you think I forgot anything or have anything else to add to the topic about system bottlenecks, and we can go from there. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.